So we did propose, as part of the governor's budget, a $3 billion plan, but I would say that we are certainly open to early implementation.
Second question, thank you for your succinct answer. Second question is, have you ever looked at how we can use cap and trade monies to create, or can do it, to create a dedicated revenue stream? And by that, either the use of revenue bonds or the use of revolving loans in order to leverage and expand the investment. I know, we have at least 3-year implementation cycles or something like that. I don't know if it's ever forever, but why can't we be more creative in how we spend the dollars?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I mean that's most certainly an option that we can explore more. I think one of the key comments that we received in the public workshops and the investment plan was that we should explore more kind of innovative financing mechanisms. That was a comment that we had heard throughout the summer, and as a result, as part of our governor's budget proposal, we have a $20 million for the iBank to try to leverage more private financing for some of these energy efficiency projects to really use the money to leverage additional funds. So we are open to different types of innovative financing mechanisms. That was kind of the one that we thought would be the highest priority, but we're open to other ideas too.
Continuously appropriate large sums of money. I thought there's an opportunity here on revolving loans or something that would accelerate the investment, whether it's in transit or whatever it is. There's some opportunities there. I didn't know if there was a legal impediment. That's it.
I know the LEO is up next, and we'll talk about beyond the year 2020. That's all right. But while I have you here, are there current statutory constraints that, whether it's the Air Board or the EPA, that are limiting your ability to really reduce greenhouse gases? Are there some, once in a while the legislature needs to check in with the departments and saying, we thought we did all these wonderful things, but are there, for you guys to cost effectively reduce greenhouse gases, is there something you'd like to bring to our attention? It's an open question.
Sure.
Yeah, it is. I'm learning to think before I speak. But, I think we've got a good range of programs that run us up through 2020. As you may know, we're giving consideration to, okay, now we've identified what programs are where we'd like to be in 2030. And I think that it's fair to say we're doing an assessment of are there changes or statutory fixes that might help us to achieve those 2030 targets. So we are looking at those right now. And I'm sure there'll be discussions with the legislature as we move ahead.
As far as the Air Resources Board is concerned, I think the main area that I've been spending time with staff on is how we more rapidly turn over the fleet, not just of passenger vehicles, but also of the whole freight system. And there's a whole range of different issues that are embedded in that we will be coming back to you about, and we may be looking for changes in the way we administer some of the programs that provide funding for demonstration and other projects. We desperately need to move forward faster in terms of getting changes out there in the communities.
I know you run a blend of different programs. Some are command and controlled regulations, and others are incentive-based to achieve this. Is there some analysis that you have on sort of what's working best? I know a lot of questions have hinted around what's the most bang for our buck, and should we as a legislature be looking at more incentive-based opportunities so we can combine these dollars that cap and trade is putting in with the private sector, or should we just be ordering people to do things?
I think we need to be doing both. We did do a lot of analysis around the first scoping plan, and we're doing more around this plan that's going to be coming forward this year to try to really pin down what the best mix of these measures is. We don't do any regulations these days at ARB that don't include some element of an economic incentive program in them that years ago would have been considered, wildly different, whether it's banking or trading or credits or, all of our regulations now have some of these features in them. At the same time, what we hear and see over and over again is that the private sector needs and wants the certainty of a regulatory structure to leverage investments so people know that there's a base out there to work from. Probably the single greatest opposition that I've experienced in a regulatory action that we've taken at ARB in the last few years, which might surprise you, is that we adjusted our truck and bus rule that affects emissions from existing heavy-duty vehicles out on the road to make it easier for smaller firms to comply during the recession. We basically softened the rule. We were sued by representatives of larger firms that had already spent the money to comply and felt very strongly that what we were doing was undercutting their competitiveness. That issue is working its way through the courts right now. We believed that we had a solid rationale for what we did, of course, both an economic rationale and a legal rationale. But that issue is still being litigated because, again, you have a complex industry and competitive forces at work, and people want to see the regulations in place that apply in an equitable way to all players in that particular market. So just a comment on your question.
No, Paris provided us with a kaleidoscope, of a mosaic of different strategies that all these countries have. And, sometimes we rely on the top down versus the bottom up. And I'm wondering, when we look at programs for local governments, should we be looking to allow them more flexibility to achieve our desired goals?
I think incentives is the word that applies there. What we hear is that in local communities where their leaders, elected leaders, and their citizens want to take action, they feel that they have no way to get the funding to do innovative programs that they would like to do.
Because I know one of the transparency elements that we talked about was that, now the nations have submitted their plans of what they thought they can do, and now they're cutting that in half or doubling up if the case may be. And the Accord, I guess it's not a treaty, it's Accord, is providing them with the technical assistance and the scientific experts. And I know we have some scientists around today at the legislature visiting our offices. Is that the type of, I guess, pay for the expertise or pay for as that is an incentive that we can make those available when they come up with their locally designed plan?
Technical assistance is one of the things we get asked for a lot by community organizations, by smaller cities, and even by big cities. We are frequently asked, couldn't you just send somebody down for 6 months to work in this department or that department to help us design our programs? And I wish I could, actually, because I think we could accomplish a lot that way. But that is definitely a need.
Strategic Growth Council, I think, has started some technical support as part of their rollout.
I was going to add that we are working on that at the Strategic Growth Council, and we recognize that the funding to the Strategic Growth Council for affordable housing and sustainable communities planning provides us with the ability to reach out and work with the local governments and assist them in adopting some programs to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we're developing the technical assistance program so that we're reaching out to communities that might not otherwise be able to approach the state.
Which is one of those lessons, the beauty of Paris. One of the lessons that we saw is how the nations were actually, assisting those who needed the help.
Thank you, Mr.
Senator Leno.
Madam Chair, I would imagine you're familiar with one of the governor's environmental awardees just last week, a group out of Oakland called REV. So there are now businesses like REV which deal with small businesses, small communities, municipalities to inform them. They put them through a 6-month course, as I understand it, to help them meet their own sustainability goals. And what's eye-opening for a lot of these, in particular, small businesses or smaller businesses, medium-sized businesses, is that there is a bottom-line benefit for them, but they just don't know how to go about doing it. In some cases, there may be some upfront costs, and they're dealing with some of the funding challenges, but that once through the 6-month course and implementation, that they are saving extraordinary amounts of water and electricity in a sustainable fashion, and their businesses are benefiting from it.
That is our hope for success, is private sector.
So there is help out there. There is help out there.
It doesn't have to be just from the state.
Right.
Merci beaucoup. We are conclude this panel. Au revoir. Until we meet again. Let me call up the Legislative Analyst's Office for perhaps a different perspective on the Cap and Trade program. We have Ross Brown. And thank you for your, I read the review that you had made in the presentation. That's where we have public comment. Sure. Okay.
Thank you, chairs and members. Ross Brown with the Legislative Analyst's Office. We've been asked by the committee to comment on 3 different areas. First, some brief comments and summary of the legal requirements on the use of cap and trade revenues. Second, I'm going to talk about some more high-level policy considerations and factors that we think the legislature should be considering when thinking about using the funds in a way that can maximize its benefits and minimize the costs of emission reduction activities. And then finally, I'm going to discuss some of the issues of information and the type of information that we feel like might be helpful for the legislature to have in order to evaluate the degree to which different spending proposals help achieve its goals and its priorities. So I'm going to skip over a few of the items in the handout just in the interest of time. The first page of your handout, I hope everybody has one in front of them, is just background information. I'll skip over that. I know you all know that well. The second page is just some description of the expenditures that have been made so far and the allocations that have been made so far and the revenue that's coming in. Our estimates are that it's over $2 billion in cap and trade revenue in the current year and in the budget year as well. There's also a mention of the governor's $3.1 billion expenditure plan. That's not the focus of my comments today, is not on sort of the specific proposals in that expenditure plan. We're, of course, in the process of analyzing that, and we'll have more comments in the coming weeks.
We're looking forward to that report that's being prepared.
So turning to page 3, really gets at a summary of just sort of the legal considerations, and really broken out into 2 categories. First, the statutory requirements on the use of the funds, and really the key statutory requirement that the funds be used to facilitate greenhouse gas emission reductions, as you all know. In addition, to the extent feasible, the funds are to be used to encourage other types of benefits, whether they be economic, other environmental benefits, and public health benefits. Another key part of statute is the requirement to spend a certain portion of the funds on projects located in or benefiting disadvantaged communities. The second key factor, I think, to keep in mind is just the sort of constitutional considerations and potential sort of court considerations on the use of the funds. Given that the cap and trade program was approved with a majority vote, there's an ongoing court case related to the authority to collect the cap and trade auction revenues. It's not entirely clear sort of what the courts will ultimately say about sort of what the requirements on the funds will be. But it seems likely that there would be some sort of requirement that the funds be used on greenhouse gas emission reduction activities, similar to what's in current law. So I'm going to move to page 4 now and discuss some of the policy considerations. And a lot of this conversation builds on a recent report that we released a couple of weeks ago, trying to provide some high-level comments on the role of cap-and-trade revenues in the broader context of the cap-and-trade program and states' climate policies. And really, one of the main things we tried to do in that report, and what I'm going to try and do here, is sort of take a step back and look at the role of cap-and-trade revenues and its relation to the cap-and-trade regulation itself, and how those two interact with one another. And so first, looking at the regulation and sort of what the goal of the regulation is really to ensure the state meets its GHG goals and provide an incentive for the most cost-effective emission reductions. And those two goals are accomplished by, one, the Air Resources Board issuing a limited number of allowances that only allows a certain level of emissions from major sources of emitters, and two, allowing businesses to buy and sell those allowances and establishing a price on carbon emissions, which then sends a signal to businesses and households to reduce their emissions in the most cost-effective way. So we think that's really sort of the key, that's the key component of the cap-and-trade program. As a result of operating that program and just determining how to distribute allowances, the state generates some revenue. In our view, and I think from sort of most economists' perspective, the generation of the revenue is not really the primary goal of the program. The goal is to set the cap and limit emissions and provide an incentive for reductions. And the revenue that comes in, again, from an economic perspective, is largely sort of a byproduct of operating that program. And so page 5 just gives a very simplified schematic of the role of cap and trade and how really just issuing the limited number of allowances is really sort of the key factor that determines the overall level of emissions from sources that are subject to the cap and trade program, including transportation fuels, electricity, large industrial sources. And so it's really that cap or the number of allowances that determines your overall level of emissions. So turning to page 6, and I'd be happy to sort of walk through any of the figures, but I'm going to try and move through just for the sake of time. 6 gets at, I think, one of our key points that we made in our report, which is really sort of given the legal requirement to spend the funds on greenhouse gas emission reduction activities, how does that interact with the regulation itself and the cap and the number of allowances that are issued? And there are some complex and perhaps sort of unexpected interactions and maybe even counterintuitive sort of interactions between those things. And really, I think our key point that we want to make is that really as long as the cap is limiting the overall level of emissions, that subsidizing or encouraging a particular type of emission reduction from those same sources that are subject to the cap will simply free up an allowance that was previously being used by one entity and make it available for another entity to use. And so the net effect is to essentially change the sources of emissions that occur, but not necessarily the overall level of emissions. The overall level of emissions is essentially established by the number of allowances that are issued. And by changing the sort of different mix of emission reduction activities that occur, there's the possibility that it's in fact sort of encouraging a more costly mix of overall emission reductions. So we think this is a very sort of important factor to keep in mind when thinking about, well, when spending money on greenhouse gas emission reductions, what are sort of the net effects when taking into account sort of this market-based mechanism that's out there and the presence of allowances and the buying and selling of allowances. And page 7 includes a figure that sort of tries to illustrate this point, which is, again, that it's the cap that's established by the Air Resources Board, or the number of allowances that are issued, is really sort of the primary driving factor of overall level of emissions, and sort of spending on activities that reduce emissions from those sources may simply sort of move emissions around. And so I think that leads us to just some comments and thoughts on, well, given some of these interactions, how do we think the legislature might want to think about perhaps targeting resources in a way that encourage the most cost-effective reductions or encourage additional net reductions or other things. So if you turn to page 8 of your handout, it summarizes some of our comments on sort of options for prioritizing different types of projects or strategies for targeting funds in light of some of these interactions. The first category, I guess, is just under the category of under the current legal requirement to spend on activities that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And one strategy might be to target emissions that are outside of the CAP sector. So there's been some discussion on methane emissions or on emissions from refrigerants. Those are all sources that are not part of the cap and trade program. And so by spending on activities that reduce emissions from those sources, you don't have the type of interaction that I just described with the cap and trade program and the buying and selling of allowances. So that's one potential factor to consider when prioritizing.
Isn't agriculture also a big uncapped activity?
Agriculture, yes. Yeah, sorry, I failed to mention that, right.
Elephant sitting here.
Another strategy is to think about ways in which the funds can be targeted to sort of encourage more cost-effective mix of reductions. I mentioned, again, the goal of the cap and trade program and the allowance prices is to provide that incentive to households and businesses to undertake those activities, but there are likely some cases where that isn't enough. For some reason, sort of the incentive doesn't make its way to a business or to a household in a way that sort of provides an adequate incentive. And so there may be ways to use the funds to help push that along or sort of correct the incentives and make them accurate and right. The third category that we talk about is maybe thinking about the co-benefits, and that issue has been discussed before. Again, if the cap is there to sort of help you meet your GHG goals, then maybe thinking about the revenue that's coming in and how it can be used to help achieve other legislative goals and co-benefits, which could include improvements in regional air quality, could include water conservation, could include financial savings for low-income households by lowering their energy bills. And so maybe that's sort of one frame that you might want to think about when targeting the funds. At the bottom of page 8, we also lay out another scenario, an option, which is removing the requirement to spend on greenhouse gas emission reductions, which would require a 2/3 vote. And we point to, I think, a lot of the advantages associated with taking that approach.
Well, we wouldn't be defendants, would we?
Excuse me?
We would stop being defendants, right? We wouldn't be sued.
It would remove a lot of legal uncertainty. That's one factor. I think from a policy perspective, it would just give a lot more flexibility to use the funds in a way that helps the legislature achieve its highest priorities and its goals. And that could include using the funds to provide rebates to households and consumers to help offset the costs. Chair Nichols talked about the program that the IOUs are implementing to do something similar, having additional flexibility for the state to use the funds to do a similar type of thing. Or it could give additional flexibility to achieve other climate-related goals like climate adaptation, as you've talked about, or just other policy priorities that are the biggest priorities for the legislature. And it's important to keep in mind, even if that flexibility is given and funds are used elsewhere, again, going back to if the cap is in place and is limiting emissions, then you're still likely to achieve your overall greenhouse gas goals. So page 9, just speak briefly about the issue of information and what type of information might be most helpful to you when sort of thinking about how to prioritize different spending options. And the first category I think we're going to talk about is just the general framework for spending and how to think about spending. And in our view, the 3-year investment plan is a good venue for perhaps sort of thinking about a framework for spending and how to choose programs and prioritize programs and and target to activities that either reduce the most greenhouse gases or do it most cost effectively. Unfortunately, our review of the investment plan that was just recently submitted finds that the investment plan provides limited analysis of how some of the different options, interact with regulations, like we just talked about, and the degree to which one particular program will help achieve overall benefits, whether they be greenhouse gas benefits or most cost-effective reductions or other types of co-benefits. There's a description of a lot of different programs that many of them, I'm sure, have significant merit and can provide quite a bit of benefit. But there's no robust analysis of sort of how to target funds to the types of programs that provide the most benefit, and a robust sort of description of what types of benefits are being offered and how to sort of compare one program to another necessarily. And so I think one thing the legislature might want to think about is, how can it help sort of push the administration or push for more information that can provide a little bit more context and provide more of a framework for thinking about how to spend money. And one option that we raise here in the handout is thinking about establishing some sort of expert committee. I think, to be fair, these are difficult questions. These are very difficult. These are very different programs, and really sort of evaluating the merits of an energy efficiency program relative to a transportation program, or even within the categories, trying to balance the different programs. It's difficult in trying to understand how they interact with other regulations, and so getting more sort of expertise, and whether they be economists and scientists, to help sort of establish that type of framework that can really help the administration and the legislature think about how to target funds in a way that really achieve the most benefit might be useful. Finally, page 10, just getting into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of, for the individual programs that are proposed in the budget, what can be done to sort of help understand what are the net benefits of those programs, and measure and monitor what is actually being achieved. And in the short run, we will continue to ask the administration for as much information as possible on sort of what the benefits are. But in the long run, I think it's largely an issue of sort of looking at what types of outcomes are being measured by the administration, what type of information is being provided about how successful the different programs are, how reliable is that information. Again, these are very complicated programs that operate in sort of a broader context of incentives and market structures and regulatory structures. And so trying to get at, what is sort of the true net benefit of one particular program relative to another, and information that can really help the legislature prioritize among the wide variety of different options that it's looking at and the administration is proposing.
Because there's not really an analysis between the first investment plan and the proposed second investment plan, and or at least I didn't see it. I don't know if you read it, where they said this wasn't really working, so we decided that we want to underfund this, and this was really working. It was just apples and oranges and pears, and here's all the fruit, and choose what you want.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't see that in the analysis either, and perhaps that type of exercise was undertaken and that was done, but it wasn't sort of clear from the investment plan sort of how the administration arrived at, well, this is the appropriate sort of mix of funding strategies, and these are the programs that are sort of going to help us reach our goals in the most effective way.
Also, I didn't see, and maybe you did, these smaller programs that might provide great benefits. I met one of these garbage guys, Lou Pirelli in Santa Clara, that's going to take food waste and dehydrate it and make Kibbles food. And evidently the dogs and cats love it. And, it's actually it's $150,000 investment instead of a $10 million anaerobic digester. Now, we all, my crowd likes the anaerobic digester, but there doesn't seem to be those programs for these. I remember them in the energy sector. We give some seed money to these ideas to develop something, but in this greenhouse gas reduction, didn't see any. In the second phase, didn't see that detail that you're talking about. Did you?
No, and I think part of it might be, I mean, the investment plan, I think, is sort of intended to be sort of a higher level look and trying to sort of think about which sort of categories of funding and even sort of bigger programs where the funding might go, and some of the sort of more detailed sort of targeting of funds might be sort of later on in the process through the sort of typical budget process. But in general, just sort of the exercise of really thinking through which categories of what types of benefits are we getting from a particular type of spending on the GHCG side in particular, and how are we going to sort of prioritize funding in a way that really helps us sort of meet our goals in the most effective way. It's something that we didn't see a lot of in the investment plan. So.